Stand by. We'll start rolling and be back with you. Here we go. Okay, Josh, you're on.
All right. The American Revolution, a proud moment in our American history where our forefathers broke from British rule to establish a more pure form of government. It was a courageous thing, but sometimes I need to ask myself, was that in violation of the principles in Romans 13:1 and 2? Which brings us to our text. Romans 13:1 and 2 says, "Every person is to be in subjection to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves." Now, I'm not anti-American at all, and I'm not really trying to bash the American Revolution. I haven't even formed my own opinions on what I think about that. But I do want us to start thinking through a biblical lens instead of a cultural lens about what's acceptable, and specifically in regards to obedience to our authority. With that in mind, I want to give two teachings regarding Christian submission to authorities. Two teachings regarding Christian submission to authorities. The first teaching I want to talk about is every person is to be subject to governing authorities. Every person is to be subject to governing authorities. And the text says, every person is to be in subjection to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. So within that teaching, I want to look at the command and the reason for the command. First, the command. The command is that every person is to be subject to governing authorities. Our generation loves to think of Jesus as the countercultural Jesus, Jesus the rebel. And Jesus was countercultural, otherwise he wouldn't have been as revolutionary in his teaching as he was. And he broke the mold, but he wasn't countercultural for the sake of being countercultural, and he wasn't necessarily a rule breaker as far as his governing authorities. So I want to step back, and I want to look at some of the things some aspects of Jesus' ministry to give us a better perspective about his place with governing authorities. First is that Jesus was God. He was the authority. Jesus is one of the second person in the Trinity who created the entire universe. But as Philippians says, he took the place of a servant. He lowered himself below all men. And as far as we know, above governing authorities as well. We don't have any accounts of Jesus breaking government rule blatantly. Secondly, when Jesus was accused of breaking rules, specifically the religious rules, he used the Torah to show that he wasn't actually breaking religious rules. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, the ones who often accused Jesus of being a rule breaker, they were interpreters of the law and were accusing Jesus of breaking the Torah. So Jesus would use the Torah to show them, no, you don't understand the Torah. This is what the law says. This is what Scriptures say. An example of this is when Jesus and the disciples were picking heads of grain in the field on the Sabbath, and the religious leaders tried to accuse him of breaking the Sabbath laws, and Jesus rebuked them using the law itself. Thirdly, in Matthew 22:17 through 22, Jesus tells the religious leaders to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And what he was talking about was paying taxes. Jesus told them, if Caesar demands taxes, pay taxes. So those are just some of the things I wanted to show in Jesus' life regarding authority. But second, I want to show Paul's reason for the command to obey governing authority. His reason is that, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Now, maybe it's just my American mindset. When I read that, it almost seems illogical. I think to myself, did Paul know the authorities that we were under? Did he know how corrupt governing authorities were? And I think the answer is yes. I think Paul was well aware of the political situation of the day. Just to give us an idea of that, Rome, during the time when Romans was written, was under the authority of Nero. This was before the persecution of the Christians, but I highly doubt that Nero was the example of a Christian godly leader. So the immediate context of this command to the Romans would have been, everyone must be in subjection to Nero, and the authority of Nero is established by God. And that's pretty strong. That's a pretty strong command. And with Paul's political savviness, especially with Roman politics, I I definitely would like to believe that Paul was well aware of the political situation in Rome at the time. So what does it mean when it says there's no authority except from God? It's not saying that all authority is godly. It's just speaking of God's sovereignty over authority. And as Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is like the channels of water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. So it means that God is sovereignly in control of history. God's not doesn't work within the political realms. He's control of the political realms and does his work in spite of whatever leaders are in power. This brings us to, and Pharaoh is a good example of this in Exodus. Teaching number 2, whoever resists authority is opposing God. Whoever resists authority is opposing God. And the text says, therefore whoever resists authority is opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Why would Paul command believers to be in submission to pagan authority? To understand this, we need to apply the 3 main rules of hermeneutics. And if you guys have taken hermeneutics, you know that's context, context, context. So I'm going to look at the context of Romans 12 and 13 and maybe get an idea of what Paul is getting at, why he would give Christians this kind of a command. Basically, Romans 12 and before this passage and the rest of Romans 13 is giving a list of commands that help believers be at peace with everyone. To be blameless in their love for each other. And I want to give some verses to help us get the idea of what Paul is talking about. Romans 12:18 says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Romans 12:19 through 20 says, to be at peace with your enemy. Romans 12:21 says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And I think we could summarize it all by looking at Romans 13:8, where it says, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. So what Paul is getting at here is that us Christians are to be blameless in our love, even blameless in the eyes of authority when possible, so that nobody has anything against us, and we, as best as we can, I guess. And as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9:22, I become all things to all men so that I may save some. So we become servants of all, servants of even our governing authorities, in order that we may be blameless in the eyes of as many people as possible. And there are exceptions to this rule. The main exception is that we're not to conform to the ungodly worldviews and the ungodly practices of our governing authorities. As Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And we see a lot of biblical saints who did oppose authority when authority was commanding them in some way, shape, or form to disobey God. We see Daniel when he refused to stop praying. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down to an idol made by man. Peter and John refused to stop preaching the gospel when the religious council told them to stop. Jesus, when he was on trial, didn't back down from saying that he was the Son of God, even though they tried to get him to recant that. So it's clear that God's law is primary. So what's my conclusion? I think my conclusion even makes myself cringe sometimes because of my American individualism, and I think it may us as well. And before I state my conclusion, I want to say that I want to leave it up to the conscience of the individual to interpret the spirit of the law. And I don't want to give a defined rule about the spirit of the law, but my conclusion is this. Wherever our worship of God and obedience to his commands is not hindered, we are to obey our governing authorities in obedience to God. Wherever our worship of God and obedience to his commands is not hindered, we are to obey our governing authorities as obedience to God.
Okay, total time is 9 minutes and 20 seconds. I'll buy that conclusion.
All right.
Yeah, I'll buy that.